In the year 1720, on a sweltering July afternoon in Paris, 15 people were crushed to death outside a bank. They weren't storming it. They weren't robbing it. They were trying to trade paper for bread. History remembers this moment as the collapse of the Mississippi bubble, a financial scandal, a speculative frenzy gone wrong. But that's not what really happened. What happened in France between 1716 and 1720 wasn't a bubble. It was a state-sponsored hallucination. It was the first time a government tried to print its way out of bankruptcy. And when the ink dried, the kingdom didn't just lose money. It lost its future. This is the story of how one man, a fugitive Scottish gambler, convinced an empire to bet everything on a swamp. And how, when the cards were finally turned over, France discovered it had been playing with a marked deck. The Sun King was dead. Louis XIV had ruled France for 72 years. He built Versailles. He conquered half of Europe. He made France the cultural center of the world. But when the accountants opened the books in 1715, they found something terrifying. The national debt stood at 3 billion livres. Annual tax revenue was barely 145 million. The interest alone was devouring every penny the state could collect. France wasn't broke. It was mathematically insolvent. The economy had flatlined. Merchants couldn't trade because nobody had cash. Peasants were starving because the taxes had bled them dry. The army hadn't been paid in months. The crown passed to a 5-year-old boy, Louis XV. Real power landed in the hands of the regent, the Duke of Orleans. He was intelligent, cultured, and utterly desperate. His advisers gave him the old playbook: debase the currency, repudiate the debt, declare bankruptcy. But those were medieval solutions. They would destroy France's credit for a century. The regent needed a miracle. And as fate would have it, a miracle worker had just arrived in town. His name was John Law. He was tall, handsome, and extraordinarily charming. He was also a wanted man. Years earlier in London, he had killed a romantic rival in a duel over a woman. He fled to avoid the hangman's noose. For 2 decades, he drifted across Europe, making his living at the card tables of Venice, Genoa, and Amsterdam. He was a professional gambler. He understood odds, risk, and the psychology of human greed better than any economist alive. But Law was more than a card sharp. He was a financial visionary. While watching gold coins slide across velvet tables, he had an epiphany. Money, he realized, wasn't wealth. Money was just a tool for exchanging wealth. The problem with France wasn't that it lacked wealth. It lacked the medium to move it. France was choking on a deflationary crisis. There simply weren't enough coins in circulation to facilitate trade. A farmer might have a barn full of wheat. A weaver might have a shop full of cloth. But neither could trade because neither had silver coins. The economy was dying of thirst while sitting next to a river. Law secured an audience with the regent. He laid out a plan so radical it sounded like alchemy. Banish gold coins. Replace them with paper money. Print as much as the economy needed to breathe again. More money meant more trade. More trade meant more jobs meant more tax revenue, and from that revenue the crown could pay off its debts. The regent had no other options. He gave the Scottish gambler the keys to the French economy. In May 1716, Law established the Banque Générale. It was the first central bank in French history. The bank began issuing paper banknotes. Law promised they were fully backed by gold and silver. Anyone could exchange paper for coin at any time. The French people were skeptical. They remembered kings who had debased the currency. Why trust a piece of paper signed by a foreigner? But Law was a master of psychology. He made his paper better than metal. The official silver coins of France fluctuated in value depending on royal whims, but Law's banknotes were redeemable for a fixed weight of silver. Suddenly, merchants preferred the paper. It was lighter, easier to transport, and stable. The paper money began to circulate. And just as Law predicted, the economy began to thaw. Trade picked up. Tax revenue flowed. The regent was delighted. But this was only the first act. Law needed a vehicle. He needed a way to absorb the mountain of government debt. He looked across the Atlantic Ocean. France owned a massive territory in North America called Louisiana. It stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. It was a vast, untamed wilderness centered on the Mississippi River. To most Frenchmen, Louisiana was a mystery. To John Law, it was a blank canvas. In 1717, Law convinced the regent to grant him a monopoly. He formed the Company of the West, later known as the Mississippi Company. The French government gave Law exclusive rights to all trade and colonization in Louisiana. The deal was simple on paper. The company would develop the territory, find gold mines like the Spanish had in Mexico, and establish tobacco plantations. The profits would flow back to France, enriching shareholders and saving the kingdom. Law now controlled the national bank and the nation's most valuable overseas asset. He was ready to build a financial machine the world had never seen. He was about to create the first modern stock market bubble. To make the Mississippi Company succeed, Law needed investors. But Louisiana in 1717 was nothing but swamp. There were no cities, no mines, barely any settlers. So Law did what every great promoter does when reality is lacking. He sold the dream. He launched one of history's most aggressive propaganda campaigns. He hired illustrators to create engravings of the Mississippi Territory. These images didn't show alligator-infested bayous and choking mosquitoes. They showed a Garden of Eden. The engravings depicted happy natives offering French settlers chunks of gold and emeralds. They showed fertile plains waiting for the plow. They showed mountains of silver gleaming under the sun. Law's message was simple. The Spanish found gold in Mexico. We found it in Mississippi. Buy stock, get rich. He released the first batch of shares at 500 livres each. But here was the stroke of genius that hooked the nation. He allowed investors to pay not with gold or silver, but with government debt bonds. Remember, France was drowning in war debt. Thousands held these bonds, the billets d'etat, which were practically worthless. They traded at massive discounts, sometimes 20% of face value. Law told the people, "Give me your worthless debt, and I'll give you shares in a company that owns half of America." It was irresistible. It was a national debt for equity swap. The French public rushed to trade their bad debt for Louisiana dreams. The first share issue sold out immediately. Law issued more and more. To keep prices rising, Law merged the bank and the company. He used the bank's printing presses to create paper money. The bank then lent this money to investors at low interest rates so they could buy Mississippi shares. It was a perfect loop. The bank printed money. People borrowed it. They bought shares. Buying pushed prices up. Rising prices attracted more buyers who borrowed more money to buy more shares. By 1719, Paris had descended into madness. The share price, originally 500 livres, smashed through 1,000, then 2,000, then 5,000. The center of this hurricane was a narrow Paris street called the Rue Quincampoix. This became Wall Street of the 18th century, but far more chaotic. The street was so crowded that guards blocked both ends at night to clear the bodies. Aristocrats, soldiers, servants, and priests rubbed shoulders in the mud, screaming out prices. The social order of France evaporated. The only thing that mattered was whether you owned Mississippi stock. There are legendary stories from that street. One tells of a hunchback who made a fortune renting out his back as a writing desk for brokers. Another speaks of a woman who crashed her carriage near where Law was dining, faking injury just to speak with him about shares. The wealth being generated was staggering. Servants who invested meager wages suddenly became richer than their masters. A new word was invented to describe them. The French called them millionaires. It was the first widespread use of the term in history. By late 1719, the share price hit 10,000 livres. The company was now valued at more than all the gold and silver in Europe combined. John Law was no longer just a Scottish gambler. He was the most powerful man in France. The regent appointed him Controller General of Finances. He controlled tax collection, the mint, colonial trade, and the national debt. He was the entire economy, and on paper he had saved France. The crushing national debt had vanished. It had all been converted into Mississippi shares. The king didn't owe money anymore. The company did. As long as the share price stayed high, everyone was happy. But behind the scenes, Law faced a terrifying problem. The hype was moving faster than reality. He had promised gold mountains and thriving cities in Louisiana, but the colony was a disaster. To keep stock prices up, Law needed to show progress. He needed to show Louisiana was being populated, but no respectable Frenchman wanted to move to a swamp. So Law turned to coercion. He swept the prisons of Paris. He took thieves, murderers, and debtors. He put them in chains and marched them to the ports. He rounded up prostitutes and homeless women, forced them to marry male prisoners, then dragged them onto ships. These unfortunates were paraded through Paris on their way to the coast. Law's propagandists called them colonists eager to build the new empire. In reality, they were slave labor being sent to die, and die they did. Disease ran rampant on the ships. Of the thousands sent, fewer than 20% survived. They died of yellow fever, starvation, and exhaustion. The Garden of Eden was a graveyard. Back in Paris, Law suppressed these reports. He censored letters from the colony. He bribed newspaper editors. He kept the printing presses hot, churning out more paper money to keep liquidity flowing. But a bubble is fragile. It relies entirely on faith. As long as everyone believes prices will rise, they rise. But the moment the smart money cashes out, gravity takes hold. In late 1719, cracks appeared. A few wealthy investors, princes, and savvy merchants looked at the numbers. They calculated the real value of Louisiana trade. It was zero. They compared it to the stock valuation. It was a hallucination. They quietly exited. They sold shares at the peak, collecting millions in paper banknotes. But they didn't want paper. They knew it was being printed into infinity. They wanted something real. They took wagon loads of paper to Law's bank and demanded gold and silver coin. At first, Law paid them. He had to. The entire system depended on the promise that paper equaled gold. But as more millionaires tried to cash out, the vaults began emptying. One famous incident involves the Prince de Conti, a powerful nobleman angry with Law. He sent 3 wagons to the bank demanding they be filled with gold in exchange for paper. Law paid him, but he was terrified. If just a few more princes did the same, the bank would break. Law went to the regent and begged for help. He argued these people were sabotaging the economy by hoarding gold. He convinced the regent to pass tyrannical laws to stop the bleeding. First, they made it illegal to export gold from France. Then they devalued gold coinage, trying to make paper seem more valuable. Finally, in a desperate move, Law made it illegal to own large amounts of gold or silver jewelry. They sent police to raid wealthy homes. Servants were paid rewards to inform on masters hiding gold. The French government was now confiscating real wealth to force people to use fake wealth. The atmosphere in Paris shifted from euphoria to paranoia. Trading in the Rue Quincampoix became violent. The smart money had left. Now the middle class held the bag. They looked at their expensive shares and stacks of paper. For the first time they wondered if anything backed it all. John Law sat on a throne of dynamite, and in early 1720 the fuse was lit. The year began with cold wind blowing through Paris streets, carrying the first scent of panic. The Mississippi bubble had peaked. The stock price, which touched 10,000 livres, began to wobble. The psychological spell Law had cast was breaking. For 3 years the French had suspended disbelief. They believed paper was gold. They believed swamp was paradise. They believed debt was wealth. Now economic gravity was reasserting itself. The crisis began with a slow leak. The wealthy and well-connected saw the writing on the wall. They realized paper profits were illusions. They quietly sold, dumping thousands of shares, collecting millions in banknotes. But they didn't keep the paper. They knew Law had printed far too much. The money supply had ballooned past 1 billion livres, far exceeding the value of all goods and services in France. The smart money knew inflation was coming. They converted paper into anything real. They bought diamonds, silverware, country estates. Most damaging, they demanded gold coin from the bank. Law watched this exodus with growing terror. He was now Controller General, effectively Prime Minister. He had absolute power, but was powerless to stop the market correcting itself. He saw gold draining from vaults and realized the bank would be insolvent within weeks. He decided to fight the market, not with economics but with tyranny. In January and February 1720, Law convinced the regent to pass totalitarian decrees that turned France into a financial police state. Since people preferred gold to paper, Law criminalized gold. He issued an edict banning gold and silver coin export. When that didn't work, he went further. He made it illegal for any French citizen to own more than 500 livres in gold or silver. It was a shocking violation of property rights. Overnight, the traditional money used for thousands of years became contraband. To enforce this, Law unleashed terror. He empowered police to conduct warrantless home searches. They tore up floorboards and smashed cellars looking for hidden coin. Worst of all, Law encouraged betrayal. He offered rewards to anyone informing on neighbors or masters hiding gold. Servants denounced employers. Brothers denounced brothers. Prisons filled with people whose only crime was saving their savings from a crashing system. The most bizarre decree was yet to come. In a desperate attempt to prop up paper share values, law declared manufacturing and selling gold jewelry and silverware was prohibited. He tried to erase precious metals from France's collective consciousness. He wanted to leave people no option but paper. For a brief moment, terror worked. People were too afraid to use gold, so they used paper. But this created a new monster. Hyperinflation. Because the wealthy were dumping stocks, a flood of paper money hit the streets. Because government banned gold, all that money chased the few remaining real goods. Food, cloth, land, prices skyrocketed. Bread cost doubled, then tripled. A bushel of wheat that cost a few livres in 1719 cost hundreds in 1720. Millionaires who felt rich in December found their paper fortunes couldn't buy dinner in March. The illusion of wealth was stripped away by grocery bills. Law was trapped. He tried stabilizing stock prices by pegging them. He declared the bank would buy any Mississippi share for 9,000 livres. It was fatal. It meant government was printing infinite money to buy worthless stock. The printing presses ran red-hot, working day and night, churning out millions just to pay investors selling shares back to the state. The money supply exploded. Currency became a joke. Foreign merchants refused French paper. Imports stopped. Shortages began. By May 1720, John Law, who promised to eliminate debt, had created financial apocalypse. Paper money in circulation was 4 times larger than all gold and silver in the kingdom. In this chaos, Law made his fatal error. He decided to deflate the bubble. He had to bring paper value back to reality. He approached it like a mathematician, forgetting he dealt with human beings. On May 24, 1720, Law issued the infamous Edict of May. The decree announced that over coming months, Mississippi share value would drop from 9,000 livres to 5,000. It also stated paper banknote value would be cut in half. Law thought this was sensible adjustment. He was attempting controlled economic landing. He thought people would understand this was necessary to save the system. He was wrong. The public didn't see adjustment. They saw theft. The Edict of May was a bankruptcy declaration by the state. Government admitted money in people's pockets was worth half its face value. Trust, the only thing holding the system together, evaporated instantly. The reaction was violent. Paris exploded. Mobs poured into streets, screaming for Law's head. They called him thief, liar, and foreigner who came to destroy France. The regent, terrified by crowd anger, revoked the edict 6 days later. But it was too late. The spell was broken. You cannot unring a bell. You cannot restore faith after admitting it was all a lie. John Law was stripped of his Controller General title. For safety, the regent placed him under house arrest in the Palais Royal. The man who had been Europe's toast, courted by dukes and bishops, was now a prisoner listening to mob chants demanding his execution. The summer of 1720 was a long, hot nightmare.